The Rinoa-Ultimecia theory proposes that the final antagonist of Final Fantasy VIII is not a separate individual, but the same person seen at a distant point in the future, after time, loss, and prolonged isolation have stripped away her original identity. According to the theory, the inheritance of sorceress power does not simply change abilities, it slowly erodes the self, until what remains is defined only by survival and control. So this is not an attempt to resurrect the theory as hidden truth or secret canon. Instead, we ask something more uncomfortable. If this reading is false, why does the structure of the story keep pushing so many people toward the same conclusion? The game does not introduce sorceresses as a category or a profession. It introduces them as a problem the world never solved, a form of power that forces society to react to it. Even the game admits something crucial from the beginning. The origin of sorceresses is not history, it is legend. Garden records trace sorceress power back to ancient times, to the era associated with Hein, and in the same breath admit there is no factual evidence. That contradiction is not cosmetic. It means the world does not truly understand what a sorceress is. It only understands that they exist. In the myth, Hein is remembered as a creator figure, a source of magic, something older than law or structure. Over time, the name becomes shorthand, descendant of Hein, not as biology, as explanation, a way to label power that has no origin the world can safely define. But myth stops being abstract the moment sorceress power enters recorded history, because sorceress power is not simply magic, it is inheritance, a transfer that cannot be refused. Late in the story, Edea explains it plainly. A sorceress who wishes to die peacefully must first give up her power, which means the power itself never ends. It only moves. This is the real instability sorceresses introduce into the world. Don't that someone holds power, but that no one can ever know where it will surface next. History gives one clear example of what happens when that power becomes political. Sorceress Adele. Adele is described as Esthar's ruler, a sorceress whose reign escalated into global conflict, and the world's response to Adele is revealing. She is not killed, she is sealed, entombed in space. Because even at her worst, the world cannot safely conclude a sorceress's existence. Removing her body does not remove the problem. The fear remains intact. Then comes the sorceress the player actually meets, Edea. Edea matters because she confirms a critical fact the game never walks back. A sorceress can be overtaken. Not metaphorically, literally. Final Fantasy VIII makes it explicit that a consciousness from the future can possess sorceresses in the past, using them as vessels to move through history. This is not interpretation, it is structural to how Ultimecia operates. And once that is established, the world responds with something unprecedented. Seed. Seed is not born from curiosity or balance. It is born as a countermeasure. Cid says it without disguise. Garden exists to train seeds, and seeds exist to defeat the sorceress. Not a sorceress, the sorceress. This distinction matters. The system does not prepare for individuals, it prepares for inevitability. And this is the world Ultimecia is born into. Canonically, Ultimecia is a sorceress from the future whose objective is time compression. That is all the game ever confirms about her identity. But what defines her role is not her magic. It is her position at the end of a system designed to destroy her. She opposes Seed because Seed exists to kill her. That conflict is not incidental. It is the spine of the narrative. So when players gravitate toward the idea of Rinoa is Ultimecia, they're not chasing romance, symmetry, or coincidence. They're responding to pressure, and a future where the final sorceress attempts to compress time itself. Maybe because time is the only domain the system has not already weaponized against her. Rinoa doesn't start the story as a sorceress. She is introduced as something almost deliberately opposite. Emotional, impulsive, human. Someone who resists systems instead of embodying them, which is precisely why what happens to her later matters. Because Rinoa does not seek power. Power finds her. And once it does, it never stops adding up. Sorceress power follows one absolute rule. One does not simply die while still holding her power. It must be inherited, transferred, forced onto the next vessel. This is not symbolic. It is mechanical. The game enforces it without exception. And Rinoa becomes the point where multiple inheritances converge. First comes Adia. When Ultimecia is defeated at the end of the game, she does not die cleanly. Canonically, her consciousness travels into the past to Adia's era. Moribund, desperate. She transfers her power to Adia. But this does not make Adia a sorceress. Adia already was one. What happens here is not creation. It is accumulation. Later, Adia loses her status as a sorceress, and the power does not vanish. It does not split. It moves again, into Rinoa. The result is immediate and catastrophic. Rinoa enters a coma, not because she is weak, but because her body and identity were never prepared to contain everything Adia was carrying. And something else happens at the same time. Ultimecia can now possess her. Not because Rinoa is special, but because Rinoa is now a valid vessel. That alone already places Rinoa in a unique position. She is carrying sorceress power that did not originate in her era. Power displaced through time. But the accumulation does not stop there. There is a third lineage, Adele. Sorceress Adele is not part of Ultimecia's temporal loop. She is a separate, parallel concentration of sorceress power. The story describes Adele as physically overwhelming, destructive, and politically dominant. When Adele is finally defeated, the same rule applies. She cannot die holding her power. So it transfers again, into Rinoa. And now the situation becomes unprecedented. Rinoa is no longer a sorceress by a single inheritance. She is a convergence point. She carries the full sorceress power Adia was holding at the moment of transfer, including her original inheritance, and the power passed forward from Ultimecia, and the power of Adele, the most physically overwhelming and politically dominant sorceress recorded in history. No other character in the game is shown to inherit multiple major sorceress lineages in this way. Not Adia, not Adele, not Ultimecia on screen. Only Rinoa. By the end of Final Fantasy VIII, Rinoa is canonically a sorceress holding an accumulated concentration of power that surpasses any other living sorceress in her era. This does not make her a goddess. The game never says that. But it does place her closer to the upper boundary of what a sorceress can be. And that boundary is never defined, which is where the discomfort begins. Because the story never shows what happens next. The narrative quietly steps away from the consequences. It never answers what it means to live while holding that much inherited power. It never answers how long a human identity can remain intact under that weight. It never answers whether accumulation has a limit. And that silence is not accidental. It is structural. Because once Rinoa becomes the endpoint of multiple sorceress lineages, the story has already crossed into territory it refuses to map. Not because it wants mystery, but because any answer would require the story to define what it intentionally leaves unspoken. What happens when a system designed to manage sorceresses accidentally creates one that exceeds it? In the simplest reading, the story ends cleanly. Ultimecia is defeated. Time compression is stopped. The witch who tried to fold reality into herself is gone. So the question changes. It stops being, how do we stop Ultimecia? And becomes, what if her death changes nothing? Because the rules are still here. Because the game doesn't just give you a villain, it gives you a mechanism. A set of rules that can rebuild the same endpoint. What matters isn't whether Ultimecia is still out there. It's what that name represents. Not a person. A destination. A word the world will eventually use for whoever tries to do what was done. What the sorceress has done, or will do. The final shape a sorceress can become when power accumulates, fear hardens, and escape becomes the only remaining idea. And that is where Rinoa's fear becomes absolute. Because Rinoa ends the game carrying what no one else is shown to carry on screen. Major inheritances converged into one human life. So her fear stops being, Ultimecia will possess me. It becomes colder. What if the power I carry eventually reaches the one who will become Ultimecia? Not the witch, the human. So she chooses the first move that actually makes sense. Containment. Not bars, not chains. A pact. A self-imposed protocol. Because Rinoa has already seen what happens to a sorceress the world can't safely resolve. Adele wasn't understood. She was removed. Unreachable. So Rinoa tries to become unreachable on purpose. She chooses the sorceress memorial. Containment, not comfort. A chamber where a sorceress becomes a monitored variable instead of a wandering risk. She goes where the world can watch her, measure her, feel safer. Because she wants prevention. Because if she remains reachable, she remains usable. And if she remains usable, she becomes the bridge to the endpoint she fears. This is the point where time starts passing differently. Like a sentence, short disappearances, a return, again. long enough to delay the transfer, not long enough to vanish forever. Years accumulate through discipline. And this is where the junction system enters, not as trivia, but as motive. Rinoa is powerful, but she was never trained to be stable. Her power is inheritance, not mastery. If her mission is to prevent a future catastrophe, she does not need more. She needs control. Not control over others, control over volatility, control over spikes, over emotional surges, over the moments a system could interpret as a threat. So she takes the only language she knows about control: discipline, and how to handle something dangerous. Seeds language, systems, protocols, junctions. Because it's repeatable, because it turns fear into steps, because it makes a living weapon feel manageable, at least while she's awake. So, in this path, her waking life becomes structured, measured, junctioned. Not to become stronger, to become predictable, to become containable, to survive long enough that her power cannot be forced into succession. And that choice has a cost more dangerous than any enemy. Not because it makes her forget a name, because it teaches her to live without needing the name, long enough for Rinoa's name to vanish in time, becoming only the sorceress. Because it replaces inner continuity with procedure, and the game's warning stops being lore trivia and becomes destiny. Memory erosion is what happens when you keep paying for function with the self. So the forgetting does not arrive as collapse, it arrives as adaptation. At first, it's small. You rely on logs, on written reminders, on structured days, on protocols that never change. And then the shift happens. The most important thing doesn't fade first. The most important thing becomes the easiest to justify sacrificing. And this is where school becomes collateral, because she can't afford him close. If school stays near her, he becomes leverage. School is seed, a commander in the institution built to end sorceress threats. So she makes the second move. Distance. Not heartbreak. Containment. To her, intimacy becomes exposure. Exposure becomes a path back to what she's trying to prevent. Because the mission is bigger than the moment. Because the future is bigger than the present. Because fear always sounds like responsibility when you've lived with it long enough. Time passes, life hardens into protocol. Then, voluntary stops being accepted. History doesn't tolerate ambiguity in a sorceress. Fear becomes policy. Policy becomes enforcement. Containment becomes mandatory. And the mission silently shifts. Not prevent succession, but survive enforcement. Pressure doesn't clarify. It simplifies. Prevention mutates into escape. Avoid transfer becomes avoid capture. Avoid the chain becomes avoid the world. Delay the future becomes deny it. Orders are written. Routes are watched. A person becomes a category. Sorceress. Risk. Target. Seed doesn't need hatred, only classification. And once she is classified, the circle tightens. The future stops looking like a horizon. It starts looking like a schedule. If time remains a sequence, there is always a next step, a next order, a next extraction, a next forced ending, a next transfer. The enemy is the future. Time compression. No future, no succession, no seed, no Ultimecia. To stop the chain from producing the end again, to stop succession by destroying sequence, and that is the trap. Years of pursuit rewrite the person inside the cage until the original reason becomes unreachable, not because it was false, but because she can't retrieve it intact. By the time she reaches for time compression, Ultimecia is no longer hypothetical. She is already the hunted thing, label, role, target. The plan doesn't vanish in one moment. It gets replaced by what the body learns. Survive the next step, the next order, the next attempt to end you. So time compression stops being prevention. It becomes sovereignty, escape. A world sealed against pursuit, where no one can reach her, classify her, or finish her. There will be only me. And then the cruelty completes itself. Trying to prevent Ultimecia builds the conditions that create that name. A sorceress with accumulated power, a life defined by containment, a mind trained to live as protocol, a purpose corroded until escape feels like justice. At that point, Ultimecia isn't a person, it's what survives. And Griever makes total sense now. She doesn't haunt the future as a witch still alive. She haunts it as a fate. And it doesn't begin with hatred. It begins with someone looking at the future and thinking, if my power ever reaches that end, then I have to stop it. Those who fight with monsters should take care lest they become one. And if you gaze for long into an abyss, the abyss gazes also into you.